evening. First of all, I want to thank the participants. This has been a Herculean event to put this together. It was originally supposed to be both on the computer as well as having a face-to-face audience. This is the first time the Tree of Knowledge has done this without a face-to-face audience. And it should be very fun and exciting, and we're probably going to learn things of how to do it and how to probably do it better in the future. I want to thank Shira Levine. She has worked so hard to find all these panelists, meet with all the panelists, speak to all the panelists, organize all the panelists, and not only that, but to switch so many of our students from online to offline. We wrote so many different plans to districts and how we're changing things and switching to virtual, and yet she was able to put this panel together and be able to be here tonight with us. So I really want to spend that time thanking her.
Thank you.
I want to thank all Tree of Knowledge staff that is currently listening or that will be listening to this in the future. This was a huge change for many. For others, this was very simple. Those of us that came from the virtual schoolhouse world, this wasn't such a drastic change. But for those that were used to teaching in classrooms, that were not used to using as much technology as we're going to use now, they have literally jumped into this with all their heart and soul. And I know that at the end of the day, we are going to continue to make those differences for children, and we are going to connect with them during this very crazy time. So we started off this crazy time, I think in denial, not really believing this was going to happen. And then we went through the denial, this is not going to happen in our state. Then we went to the denial, it's not going to happen in our city. We are now in the United States in the middle of a pandemic. I don't think there's anything else to say. And we are expecting parents to switch not only to be parents, but to also be teachers and educators. We've always partnered with parents, but partnering is the key word. Now they are on the front lines, and we are the ones that are supporting them, and we are the ones that are trying to help them through this time. I'll tell you an interesting thing. I just came back from Amsterdam, which I think has helped me a little, because I went to see Anne Frank's house, and she lived in a teeny apartment for 2 years with her family under tremendous, no sunlight, tremendous worry, and she produced a world-winning book that has become very famous all over the world. My hope and goal for all the parents that are listening, and for the teachers, and for us panelists, that we can help our children through this difficult time. We can make it exciting, and maybe we can get amazing literature written and discussed through this time, because after all, we have a lot less socialization happening, a lot less playing outside happening, no gatherings. And so, you know, we have to be creative and try to look at the positive side of all of this, hope and pray to God that it ends as quickly as it began. But you know, if we come in with a positive attitude and we work with our kids, then they too will produce amazing things, just like Anne Frank did in the 2 years that she was stuck in an attic in a very, very small room, okay? Now, I'd like to introduce our amazing panelists. I'm going to start with Bela. Actually, Bela was my children's babysitter, and I'm forever grateful for anybody who worked with my children, including the babysitters. She is a special education teacher who works in a day school and has a master's degree in curriculum development and is a special education licensed teacher. And she really has been killing herself to set up her schooling back onto virtual. So we know she's pulled a lot of late hours and will continue to pull late hours, and we thank her for being here. Okay, Dr. Monica Gordon-Pershey. She's an associate professor at Speech and Language Pathology program in Cleveland State University. She's a speech and language pathology and a literacy educator. And I think that's very exciting. I'm going to add my own little notes here, because so many speech therapists today are really doing the full job of not just speech and language therapy, but also really involved in literacy. And I hope she'll address some of that herself. We have Rabbi Avram Cohn. He is a classroom teacher and a Kriya specialist and also an intervention specialist. And he's going to address some of the issues that come up in Hebrew reading and a little bit also of what it's like bilingual education for kids that are having reading and decoding issues. And last but not least, Vivian Garfunkel. She has been working with Tree of Knowledge for many, many years. She is really, I consider her one of the founding members, because she was one of my first tutors. She is a licensed special education teacher. She is a administrator, and she has really also, she actually has the benefit of having worked virtually and then also working the day schools. And so she's combining all of her expertise now to be able to help all the students that she is currently working with. So I hope that my panelist is ready to get started as we go through this very important thing to talk about reading. I want to say one personal note. I say this every time, and a book just came out. Shira can address it at the end of this recording, but a book was just written about different women, different people getting through different challenges in their life. And a woman wrote an article about me getting through dyslexia. And I actually thought that when I read the book, I was the least amount of challenges compared to some of the other people that were in the book. But the concept is that we can teach any child to read. And sometimes parents who are listening get frustrated. They just don't know what to do. It seems like they're not picking it up. And I want to consistently say that there are so many resources and so much help today. And if you have the patience and you get the correct and right help, your child will learn to read. And ultimately, our goal for teaching children reading, I had a teenager who came to me and asked me, is really reading necessary in today's day and age? You know, with voice notes, I thought it was an appropriate question. With voice notes, with the limited amount of texting vocabulary that kids are using today, with all the emojis, is there any benefit to really teaching literacy anymore? That's what he, you know, I'm rephrasing it in a nice way. And I said, there is no greater joy than being able to read a book. I thank the teachers who helped me get through my dyslexia. There is, for me, no greater joy. And as we sit there and go through quarantine, and the Hollywood studios are also getting shut down right now, I'm hoping that kids out there will re-find their joy of reading, because besides all the wonderful things it does for your brain and keeps you young, it's also a great joy if you learn how to do it right. All right, that being said, I am going to start with Dr. Gerber. And she brought up the following question, and I think that this is, I'd like her to really talk about speech language therapy, thinking that parents think that it's only for children to learn to talk. And what we're seeing now is it's not. It's there's so much more to it. So I'm going to have her address the developmental and advanced language skills in older children, what really speech therapists do in the area of language and literacy.
Hello. Am I going to be on screen?
You are on screen.
I am on screen. Okay.
Yes.
Hi, this is Monica Gordon-Hershey. I'm from Cleveland State University. I'm a speech language pathologist and literacy educator. We have often among parents the conception that speech language therapy is just speech therapy, and that this is something that is for younger children who are learning to talk and who maybe are not pronouncing sounds correctly, maybe have a little bit of stuttering going on when they're younger. And that is all true, but that is about 1/9 of what our profession can help people with. We have 9 areas of professional practice. So when we think of what children need in order to succeed in school, they need a large variety of language skills. And they certainly need the reading-related skills like phonological awareness, and they need the comprehension-related skills like vocabulary and reading comprehension, listening comprehension, and speech-language pathologists work with all of that. And we sort of take these skills apart. We think about how children's word knowledge and vocabulary contribute. We think about how their social awareness and their essentially world knowledge and their savvy contribute to that. We think about how their syntactic skills and their ability to speak in sentences and comprehend complex sentences contribute. At base, we think about children's cognition and thinking and memory and attention, all of the cognitive areas that contribute to learning. So the speech language pathologist is prepared basically to address 9 different areas of difficulties, everything from speech to language to cognition and memory and comprehension. So we're really not a service that is just about little children and learning to produce sounds. Most of the graduate speech language pathology programs do address reading and literacy because this is one of the 9 professional areas. I went beyond that kind of study for myself, and my doctorate is in literacy education. And what we're basically looking at in preparing our graduate level speech pathologists, most of the people who you would see in your schools or clinics or hospitals, would be people who have exposure to how oral language becomes the preparation for written language. How what children learn how to understand as being spoken to them, they learn to understand that when they read that. Or the things that they're able to say, then they're later able to communicate that in written language. We also look at that whole bridge between speech to print, phonological awareness, orthographic knowledge, meaning being able to recognize letters, building up words as building blocks from syllables or part words to longer words, more lengthy word constructions with suffixes and prefixes. We look at vocabulary as constructed through words, and of course we look at the idea of sentence formulation. So I made a short answer rather long, but I really did want to convey the idea that the speech language pathologist is the language expert in the building. We're the people with language in our degree name, and we are the people who are looking at how language contributes to learning.
Okay, so I have a question for you that I've gotten from parents of adolescents, and I want to address older children a little bit more tonight than younger children. And the reason is because I think in the younger children, between early intervention going on in a lot of the states, parents are taking their kids young, especially when they're not speaking or they're not speaking correctly, they have an articulation error, they're more motivated to go to a speech pathologist. But I find that in the teenage years, so many of the parents are like, we gave up already. They never picked it up. They never fixed this thing. What's the motivating factor that you can help parents of adolescents to go back into therapy, even if it may not have been successful as a young child?
So that is a wonderful question. And essentially we have to look at 2 areas of difficulty that a lot of the adolescent children have. One is catching up on perhaps lost time or lost skills, something that they didn't learn before. The other demand we have on the adolescents is trying to keep up with what's going on in their classrooms or what's going on in their tutoring situations. So the speech language pathologist will usually divide her time or his time between trying to kind of catch up on some earlier basic skills, maybe understanding that words are made of syllables, or looking at some basic vocabulary, sentence building blocks, grammar constructions, and then spending another part of her time or his time trying to keep up with the curriculum. So what kind of comprehension skills are required now? Main idea and details, compare and contrast, whatever it might be that's going on, and try to work with some of those adolescent level language demands while also filling in some of the gaps.
I appreciate your answer because I feel that until recently, Tree of Knowledge in Lakewood, New Jersey had a training for teachers. And until the training happened with a speech pathologist, and she was training all on grammar, I never even realized that speech pathologists deal with grammar. And so I encourage, I did younger years, you know what I'm saying, but not the higher level grammar that you need, as you go through your adolescence. So I encourage parents not to give up and to continue doing language therapy, because ultimately, even if it may have worked, or they may have lost skills over time, or they have a true disability, they're not age maturity where they were at the time to be able to catch some of those skills, that they continue with that therapy. I'm going to turn now to Rabbi Avram Cohn, and we're going to address some of the bilingual issues. I'm going to start with the most difficult question, and then go to some of the and then go to some of the easier questions. But the most difficult question that I get all the time is, if my kid has a language or decoding issue, should I even bother dealing with another language?
So the answer is yes and no.
Okay.
That meaning that say that in the what would be the best situation, you would say it is difficult. So let's focus on one and then focus on the other. But realistically, a child is in school and in a religious school where they're working on both languages. So you can't overlook, say, for example, you can't just do English and forget about the Hebrew, because, they're going to continue falling behind. So the answer in short is that in real life, that they really have to work on both languages.
Is there any benefit? We know that Hebrew is a more phonetic language. especially in the beginning. Does the concept of learning the Hebrew letters and the vowels prepare a kid later on for the English language, the short vowel sounds and things like that, where they have to put together vowels and letters?
So it depends, if when I work with students, I incorporate in my in Hebrew reading, I incorporate phonemic awareness, phonological awareness in that also. So in that aspect, I find that it definitely carries over. It's the same for both languages. So in that aspect, it does. But an honest answer is that to really say a comparison to say does it help for English later on, I don't have enough experience to say that enough kids comparing in both to say that in the actual recognizing the letters and vowels, does that carry over to English also?
I've also seen two methodologies within the Jewish day school movement in terms of teaching Hebrew. I've seen where we do a whole year of just Hebrew, and then we actually teach English, or the simultaneous learning, which is the morning Hebrew and the afternoon English. Do you have an opinion on that, where you take a year and just do the phonemic awareness in Hebrew and then do the English, versus doing it at the same time?
I mean, it's probably in the as I said before, it's probably better to just do one language at a time. But the curriculum usually does, most schools, and there are some schools that do one language. A lot of times they'll do English first and Hebrew afterwards. But in most places they're doing they're teaching both languages at once. So you just gotta. I always just you just gotta work with what they're doing.
Okay. Before I go into children with disabilities and their hardships in terms of reading, I want to talk about what are the components of reading, because I think that people also, just like with speech therapy, people are unaware how much language plays a role in speech therapy. I think people still are unaware of the reading components. And so I'm going to ask Bela to review the reading components, and then I will go to Vivian to speak in greater depth of comprehension.
Okay, so I often have, people say to me, oh, especially when it comes to the third grade reading test, because I've worked with a lot of kids helping them prepare for the third grade reading test. They'll tell me, oh, my kid is really smart and he reads well, but I don't know why he's just not passing the test. So what I've discovered and looked into and done a lot of really just worked with kids, I've understood that there's a lot of parts to the reading process that have to come together in order for a kid to be successful in reading. There's the phonemic awareness, which is understanding how the sounds and words come together. There's the phonics, which is understanding the rules in our language. There's fluency, like how smoothly can you read. There's vocabulary, which is how exposed you are to the language and how many words you're familiar with. Just to digress for a minute, but I was doing was mentioned before, I was doing a compare and contrast activity with some students, and I had a little girl in my class who just isn't exposed to much, and she couldn't even compare a lizard and an alligator because she's just never gone to the zoo with her family. So that's, let's say, a kid who's very weak in vocabulary. And then lastly, comprehension. So there's so many parts of the reading that have to come together in order for a student to be able to really be able to read. So we can't take that lightly. And what you were saying about how the speech pathologists work on so many different aspects of it, and how Vivian will also mention the decoding, and there's so many layers to the reading process that have to come together for a child to really be able to read successfully. We often take it for granted, but it's really the case.
I want to also, I want to address some of this when it comes to the older kids and comes to the teenagers, because they may have learned phonemic awareness. And I think most of the kids today have. I'm always surprised once in a while kids do not know the sounds, but most of them have. Phonics, they may have learned it, but they truly don't remember it. Fluency becomes the most difficult aspect because they're not used to timed reading. So when you mentioned the third grade reading test, I want to address that. Remember that our crowd is listening to this from all over the world. They don't know what you're talking about in terms of Ohio. In Ohio, they have a test called the third grade reading test that you have to pass in order to go on to the next level in fourth grade. There's high stakes testing right now in all states. Some of the private schools are mandated to do it. Some of the private schools are not mandated to do it. But the reality is that fluency is an extremely important part, both in the high stakes testing, eventually the SATs, but really if a kid is reading, decoding, and even comprehending, but cannot do it at a fast pace, especially in our computer age today, and how many different articles we're being bombarded with in social media, the fluency, by the way, plays a huge role today. Vocabulary is very important because we're not speaking with high vocabulary. And if you're a kid who's struggling with reading, you're not reading a lot. And so it's very hard for you to pick up vocabulary if you're not hearing it and you're not reading it. And now I'm going to let Vivian Garfunkel address the comprehension area and discuss this in greater detail. So if you could go ahead and discuss imagery and reading, how that plays a role, and what advice you can give in terms of improving reading comprehension.
Okay, if we take 3 circles of reading, 2 of them are what Bayla talked about. Circle number 1 would be the auditory, and as Bayla mentioned, that would be the phonological processing and the word attack. And then you have another circle which would be visual, and that would be the orthographic processing, which are the sight words and word recognition. And then you have the third circle, and that would be the language. That's where you would have the contextual reading, the vocabulary, and reading comprehension. So actually, if you have poor decoding, circle number 1 would be the auditory, and as Bayla mentioned, that would be the phonological processing and the word attack. And then you have another circle which would be visual, and that would be the orthographic processing, which are the sight words and word recognition. And then you have the third circle, and that would be the language. That's where you would have the contextual reading, the vocabulary, and reading comprehension. Something happened that it's repeating what I'm saying, so
Yeah,
let me just
I don't
see.
know. I don't know.
Okay, are we good now? I must have touched something. Are we good now?
Vivian, mute yourself for right now, and we'll come back.
We have another back to me, and I'll figure this out, okay? That would be the orthographic processing, which are the sight words and word recognition.
Mute yourself.
Then you have the third circle, that would be the language. That's where you would have the contextual reading, the vocabulary.
Okay. I don't know what happened, but we had a little bit of a technological difficulty, which, by the way, as we go through this process, and all you parents that are listening at home, welcome to the reality of virtual learning. We're always kind of going through that. I'm going to move along.
Good now?
Yeah, now you're good.
Okay. All of a sudden, I started to self-record without even pushing a button.
Okay. So continue where you were left off.
All right, so let me go back. All right. So now, if someone has poor decoding, we would call her dyslexic. If someone has poor comprehension, we would call them hyperlexia, and you lots of times see this even with autistic students. They could read, but they don't comprehend. So what I would like to discuss a little bit today is that the underlying cause of weak language and literacy skills many times is at the sensory level. We have the 2 primary weaknesses. One was the weak decoding, and then you have the weak comprehension. So what we have to do then when we have poor comprehension is to help the children learn to image what they are reading, and that will lead to comprehension. So visualization is directly related to language comprehension and critical thinking. Imagery is the primary sensory connection to the brain. Language comprehension is the ability to connect to and interpret both oral and written language. It is the ability to recall facts, get the main idea, make an inference, draw a conclusion, predict, extend, and evaluate. All these are part of comprehension. So when we working with kids with comprehension, the first thing is what we have to do is we have to have them learn how to make an image, visualize what they are reading, and after they're visualizing what they read, after that, they can verbalize what they have read, and this will lead to comprehension. That's it in a nutshell.
Okay. Now let me I'm going to take a little pause to talk to the audience here for a second. There are attendees that are online, and there is a chat in which they can ask questions. In the past, in our live audience, we've given rewards for questions that they've asked that we address, that the panel ends up addressing. So while we have prepared questions that can go on for another 2 hours, we would love to hear from attendees. So if you have a question, please type the message in the chat section. If your question is chosen, we will then send you an online gift certificate, which I'm not exactly sure where to, because we're not exactly sure where you could go at this point, but we're hoping to do Amazon because it seems like everybody could just use Amazon. So I'm encouraging the participants that are actually listening to go in and type a message so that we can ask those questions. While we're waiting for that, I'm going to now, you brought up dyslexia, and it's like, you know, it's what is dyslexia? And there's a lot of parents out there that think that dyslexia is a term that's used and it gives you a certain grade level. And I think we have to describe what it is to parents, and that it's many times comorbid, as they use that word, with other issues that this child has. So the greatest understanding right now of dyslexia is there's a difference between the clinical term and the school term. In the clinical world, dyslexia was that you were struggling with reading and struggling with language. In the school term, they primarily use it for any child who is 2 years behind in reading and on their reading level. It does not explain, and I think the parents get confused with this, it in and of itself does not give you a reason why that child is not reading. There are many children out there that are 2 years behind and they just have poor education. We would then still call them dyslexia because they're still 2 years behind reading. So I want to go a little bit into the greater concept of it, and also what you as a professional do to work with that student. So I'm going to start with Dr. Monica. I'm sure this is something you deal with all the time, and I'd like you to address how you deal with learning disabilities, reading disabilities, dyslexia, and attention deficits.
So from the speech language pathologist perspective, that's your question?
Yeah.
When you look at all of those disorders that you've mentioned, what they have in common is, well, with the exception of ADHD, what they have in common is the language basis. So the child is having difficulty learning language to begin with, or it might go pretty well, but when it comes down to the school demands and the academic use of language, that's where the child is struggling. So it becomes difficult to maybe apply skills that are innate. And parents will say, my child is very smart, they speak beautifully, they understand what I'm telling him on a daily basis, but when it comes to schoolwork, they seem to not understand, because somehow the academic language is just too abstract. It's too unrelated to what they understand and experience on a daily basis. It requires a lot of memory capacity, a lot of connections between ideas, and that's where they break down. There's something there that in these various populations that you've described. I think the difference with the children with attention deficits, it could be that they're just not really able to bring their attention and their reasoning skills to bear to work with language skills. So it's not as if anybody is missing language abilities. It's not as if any of these populations of children have an actual language loss. Really what the deficiency is this daily necessary growth in language that most children do automatically and seamlessly. These children have to be more consciously brought into an understanding of language with direct instruction and direct participation in tasks. They have to learn to make the connections between daily language and academic language very, very overtly, very, very clearly. And that would be the position of the speech language pathologist, to take things apart. As I was saying before, and as we were conversing, you and I, before about this, Nikki, the idea would be that we're the person in the room who can take language apart with the child. Sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph, word by word.
Okay, Bayla, you teach and you're an intervention specialist in schools, and I am sure that you are constantly dealing with these type of reading disorders. And what advice would you give to parents in terms of helping their children through this process?
Can you clarify that question a little bit? Helping them through the process of holding themselves afloat within a regular classroom?
Not necessarily. Maybe even in a resource room.
So, I mean, I think that and this also incorporates kind of the question that just came in about children who are trying to manage 2 languages at once. And I've really coached parents on this piece many, many times. Parents have to be their child's best advocate. And that comes to any kid who's struggling with any challenge, regardless of what it is. Parents have to be their child's best advocate, and they know their child best. So I tell parents this all the time when it comes to whatever learning disability it might be, whatever struggle it might be. Like you have to weigh all the pieces, whether it's a question, and this might be something Rabbi Cohen could weigh in also on. If your child is, whether it's Hebrew versus English, or a dyslexic child that's behind and can't function within the regular classroom, and is it tutor versus regular classroom because there's social pieces and all these things, the whole child is what's important. So there's social emotional pieces, and then there's reading and keeping up with the class. So they have to judge and weigh out, those pieces versus the academic. I'm a tutor and I'm also a mom. So you have to see, where is your child struggling the most? How can you help them while also maintaining their self-respect, all that at the same time?
Okay, there's a question from Robin. Hi, Robin, and we're going to choose your question tonight. So we'll make sure you get a gift certificate. Assuming decoding and fluency is good, okay? How do we help kids use syntactic and semantic clues to infer meaning or decipher unknown words while reading? And I think this is a good question, Vivian, for you, because that's exactly what the problem is when you have poor vocabulary. And how do you go through a sentence and you're missing the meaning of one word? How do you learn to infer via that process and figure out the vocabulary word that you're missing?
Okay. First of all, when we're talking about comprehension versus decoding, I'm very big on teaching the kids specific strategies to use, which they can take into the classroom. So if we're talking about vocabulary, you can actually teach them how to find out the definition of word through context clues. One of the hints would be that the definition many a time is embedded in the context. Sometimes the definition is in a positive and it's set off by commas. Sometimes you just reread and you figure out what is the context clue. That would help with the vocabulary. Another clinical way of dealing with vocabulary, as I mentioned, is teaching them what is the vocabulary, the definition of a vocabulary word, by having them image. How do you picture? What do you picture when you hear the word horse? What do you picture when you hear the word river? What do you see? Rather than asking them, what does the word mean? Other things that when we talk about providing strategies for students in general for comprehension is to provide them with certain things that they can do before they read, certain skills they can have during their reading, and certain things they can have after they are reading. Many times we get stuck during the reading, but we forget afterwards how to bring closure to that reading. And there are a plethora of strategies out there. And many times when I work with the kids in a clinical situation, or even in a co-teaching situation in a classroom, these are some of the techniques that I would teach the kids. I would teach them self-questioning techniques. I would teach them SQ3R, survey, question, read, recite, review. I would teach them how to use a graphic organizer. I would teach them summarization techniques. So all of those, and there are so many different strategies to teach comprehension, and you do that via the text that they're learning in classroom, and that would address for older kids how to comprehend. One of the other things that's very important for older kids, and I would recommend a wonderful book, I read it but I don't get it, by Chris Tiavani. And she talks about having kids understand where is the breaking point. Where, at what point of their reading is it that they don't understand it? Is it that they don't have the prior knowledge? Is it that they don't have, that they get the details, but they are stuck when it becomes, you know, the main idea? Is it that they can't, that they don't have the higher order thinking skills? So this is really, again, teaching them those strategies and not taking them for granted, that you just ask them a question and look for the answer.
Okay. Bayla, you wanted to add something to that?
Based on what Vivian said, I just wanted to add that another great thing that teachers can do, both in the regular classroom, in a one-on-one tutoring situation, and even moms can do, both in the exciting homeschooling days that are ahead of us, or even in you know, nighttime, bedtime rituals, or whatever it is. You can model for your kids these excellent strategies. And modeling is really one of the best ways that you can show children how you think through a passage. Like Vivian, any of the strategies that Vivian was suggesting, SQ3R or whatever it is that you're choosing, a lot of these are educationese, so I'm not going to go into them. For those parents who want helpful things, you can Google lots of them. Or even like a quickie that I do is that I have my students go through a passage, we do it together in class, and I have them always tell me at the end of a paragraph, are there any unfamiliar words that you've just read? Can you figure them out from the neighbor words? And I try to say context clues, but then I also say as neighbor words for the kids in my class who, no matter how many times I've said the word context clues, it's not enough. So that way I'm scaffolding it so they have that support. So can any neighbor words help you? That's what I call what Vivian called the commas. You know, sometimes it actually defines it for you in commas right next to the challenging word. But are there any unfamiliar words? Can you ask a neighbor? Can you get help for those words that you don't know? Do you need to look them up in the dictionary? Have you underlined any of the challenging words? So once you've cleared that all the unfamiliar words are out of the way, so you technically have cleared them all out of the way. Now let's figure out the main idea of this paragraph, and we annotate the text. So we've established that your main that you've already understood this paragraph. You cleared away all the unfamiliar words. You've described what the main idea is. That's just a real simple thing that I do with my class. And then by the end of an entire passage, these are third graders or younger. By the end of the passage, they're able to look back at their 5-paragraph passage and are able to look back and say, oh, this is what paragraph 1 was about. This is what paragraph 2 was about. Those are the steps, the pre-steps to outlining, so that they can build upon that later on.
Okay, so as the psychologist here on this panel and the BCBA, I'm going to address the comfort level that kids feel comfortable enough to ask what that word means. Many times I have struggling students that walk into the first couple sessions, and when I pick out a word and I say, do you know what this word means? They go, yeah. I go, okay, what does it mean? And they repeat the same word. And I realize that I haven't done enough to make a feeling of comfort and a safe place for them to be able to say, I do not understand that word. And so I really do. And many times kids really, they do want to know what the word means, and they really can't figure out what's going on, but they don't even realize that it's that one vocabulary word that's holding them back from understanding the sentence. And then they don't feel comfortable asking what that vocabulary word means.
So I actually did the other day. There was one word that some girls were stuck on. And in order to praise the process, not the product of figuring out what the hard word is, also, and I correct myself. I don't call it hard word. I call it unfamiliar word because it's as of yet unfamiliar. I had only the girls who were unfamiliar with it were able to come up to the front of the classroom. So if you already knew what it was, sorry, you can't come up to the front of the classroom, because I wanted to encourage the process of
Good.
figuring this out. Anyway, but this is something where, as a parent who's just sitting with a kid at night, can work with the child and just say, well, are there any words that we just read that were unfamiliar? And now, can you tell me what these 2 sentences meant? That's a simple, short comprehension activity that you can do at home.
Great.
Just
Okay,
an
I'm going to do the last question for Rabbi. And then what I'm going to ask each panelist to do is to wrap up by giving literally a 2-minute piece of advice of something like what you just said, Bela. Just
I think I'm done.
one small activity that they can do. We used to say at night, but now they have the beauty of being with them all day. So all day long, they can do that activity. So Rabbi Cohen, just one quick question. When
Yes.
you're dealing with Hebrew and you're teaching Kriya, as in most day schools, the way they teach it, you are primarily doing decoding, what I call pure decoding, because you're not really teaching the meaning of the words when you're just teaching them how to read. We don't really have that in English. We are doing decoding automatically together with vocabulary and and everything else, part of language. But because you're teaching really a foreign language and you're just in the beginning teaching them how to read and they don't necessarily know the meaning of the word, do you find that teaching it without the meanings helps or doesn't help in terms of the decoding? Because we don't really have that in the English language.
So that's one thing which is actually for some students it's a very big struggle. For example, I have one student that I'm working with is that he's on a 3rd grade English reading level, and I'm having the child is significantly younger than that, and he's having a very difficult time, decoding, and he's just the automaticity of reading one syllable is just like you do all the techniques, and it's I had to go back to the beginning and do more intense multisensory techniques with him, and finally he's making some progress, and I believe it's because we don't have he doesn't have the oral language, and this kid happens to be very articulate and his language skill level is way beyond the grade level that he is. But since he doesn't have that for Hebrew, it makes it a challenge. And a second challenge of it is that just in regards to exposure to the language, they're not reading stop signs, they're reading recipe books and reading, instructions how to build a model airplane to have more exposure. So it's really the only thing the explicit instruction that you're giving in class is the only real exposure to the language. So it just makes it much more challenging for them to master the skills.
Okay. All right, I'm going to now we're going to wrap this up, and we're going to wrap it up by giving parents some suggestions as they enter into the homeschooling arena. So I'm going to give 3 suggestions from a BCBA's perspective. Number 1, try as much as possible to stick to a regular schedule. If the school is serving lunch at 12:30, serve lunch at 12:30. Don't make it an all-day eating experience. Try to make sure that your kids do get dressed, type out or print out or whiteboard out the schedule, because we want to be able to keep them as close to a schedule as possible so that when they have to reintegrate into the world, it is not that difficult. Number 2, get dressed. And number 3, really make every effort as much as possible to keep with these wonderful school schedules that all of your schools are sending out. They're not going to be perfect the first week, but by next week, hopefully, they're going to get the hang of all these Zoom meetings, and they're going to get the hang of all these packets. And unfortunately, you now have to be the enforcer, the principal, the teacher, the parent. Create rewards, try to make positive rewards, things that you'll be able to do after we all get out of this quarantine experience. Bela, a suggestion for parents.
Well, I scheduled some time for fighting.
Oh, that's good. Okay, Dr. Hanukkah, do you have a suggestion? Unmute, you have to unmute yourself. You're muted.
I forgot to unmute myself. Okay. I made a couple of notes. Tell me if I go on too long. The first thing that I would say would be to read with your child, no matter how old the child is. Your child could be 30 and you could read with your child. That whole idea of sharing reading and just saying those words together is a remarkable experience. Also, when you're reading with the child, you're letting someone else basically take over the fluency role. We have so many parents who say, well, I'm going to read with my child tonight, but what they do is they hand the child the book and the child has to do more decoding and more performance. What I'm saying is make this a shared experience, make it entertaining, make it joyous. As much fun as you would have singing with your child, you should have reading with your child, okay? And so let these kind of automatic things occur together. The other thing that I would say would be audio books or all of the various kinds of ways that we can listen to text online now. And particularly because you're going to be at home for a while, or just because we have so many different resources now that we didn't used to have, let children listen to text as much as possible. I also want to suggest people would be very creative with their children, with their families, and include writing in your daily activities. So write things at home that you use with one another, write out your menus or something like that. Post things online. People are always posting and emailing and things like that. Be creative, create scrapbooks, include words and visuals. Vivian asked people to visualize. Well, a scrapbook helps you visualize. You got something there to look at, this artifact, and then you're writing about it. Just like when you're posting, you're visualizing. You're putting on something, putting something on Instagram or something like that. And basically keep your daily vocabulary rich and interesting. Think of things to say in creative and poetic and different kinds of ways than you normally would say it. If you are trying to look at another language, for example, just figure out, okay, so today when I come to an action word, I'm going to try to say it in the other language. You may not have to speak in full sentences in the other language. Or today when I come to a describing word, I'm going to try to say that in the other language. And also ask yourself, when you're saying something, how would a book say it? Or when you're reading the book and the book is complicated, say, well, how would I say that in daily life? Go back and forth between the language of text and the language of daily life, and try to make language, again, just as joyous as singing would be.
Okay, Rabbi Cohn, what would you, any suggestions that you have?
Yes, I mean, I'll give a specific suggestion in regards to Hebrew reading is that, you know, as again, like some parents, you know, Hebrew reading, especially you don't understand what you're reading. So it could be a very stressful task to, with your child. So, but it's especially in the Jewish schools, it's very important that they don't fall behind during this time. So it's what I would suggest is that you know, do whatever they're comfortable with. Meaning to say is if they're not, you know, comfortable, it's too much of a stress to read a passage or something like that. So just review simple one-syllable words, two-syllable words, especially in the younger grades where you're just, you know, the basic the automaticity of decoding is just starting to develop. So just do something which is not going to create too much of a stress, but also, even though it seems it's not such a big challenge, it will still, you know, be beneficial in the long run for your child's reading.
Vivian, suggestions for whom?
Yeah, well, Monica said a lot of the things that I was going to say, so I just want to elaborate on how important it is to read to your child. So one of the other things to improve the reading and wouldn't make the child resistant to reading would be, I would take turns with the child. I do this with my own students. I read 2 pages, you only have to read half a page. Then they're not that resistant to the reading. Also, give them the choice of the book. Let them enjoy the book they're reading. Reading should be fun. As Monica said, it should not be a chore. Another thing is, we talked about being a role model. In school, we used to call it sustained silent reading. And I used to do this with my kid on Friday nights. You were allowed to come into our bedroom and we would read and they would read silently. And it was a real big treat that and the entire family was sitting and reading books of their choices and actually reading because we as a parent were role modeling that particular reading. And when it comes to vocabulary, one of the enjoyable things that children like to do is word of the day. You can get it online from Webster Dictionary, word of the day, and they have to guess the word, and then they use the word, and then you post the word. And these are all enjoyable things that they could be doing during this particular time of stress, being in the home all day long.
Okay, I want to wrap it up. I want to thank all of the wonderful panelists. I want to thank all the attendees that actually sat and listened to this live, but also those that were going to listen to this in the future. We here at Tree of Knowledge Learning Academy are here to support you. We understand that this is a trying time, and we are available both online, via email. I will ask Vivian to send the book because there were some people that couldn't hear it fast enough. As part of this recording, we will also give you the name of the book that she mentioned when she was speaking, and also the emails of all the panelists that spoke tonight, so that you can be in direct touch with us. And God save us all. God save America. God help you from killing your children. We are here for you. We believe in you, and we know you can do it. Thank you. Have a good evening.